Hello, welcome back to Life on the Franch. Today we are going to be doing part 2 of the CRT series, if you will. So if you haven't seen my last video, I recommend checking that out first. That video goes over the current legislation that's up for vote and the negative implications that those laws have on education, as well as the unintended consequences to the ability to teach U.S. history at all, just by the way that they are so broadly worded. So check out that video first. For this video, we're going to be focusing more on the benefits to including discussions about race and politics and controversial issues in the classroom. It's not a specifically CRT curriculum. Again, that's not really the way to think about CRT if you've seen the last video, but having controversial issue discussions in classrooms is an ongoing push in education, and there are a lot of studies about it, so we're going to get into the pros and cons. We're going to talk about multicultural education and how it's grown and changed in the United States and where it is now. So buckle in. This is going to be informative, but I hope also interesting. And if you have any questions at all, you can leave them in the comments down below. I will be listing all of my references in the description, as well as pointing you towards a few books that I think are really useful on these topics. So where to start? Since critical race theory mostly talks about the debate surrounding how to teach U.S. history, I thought we would start by talking about the history of multicultural education in the United States. For this, I'm going to be pulling from a couple different articles, primarily. The first is a book titled Who's America? Culture Wars in the Public Schools by Jonathan Zimmerman, which does a fantastic, well-written, easy-to-read history on how different cultures advocated to be included in the U.S. history curriculum and why some were added the way they were and how some courses were added entirely separately. So, for example, the multicultural education movement is thought to have started actually with Germans and Irish Americans. At the time, schools were taught with religion involved, so they would be reading Protestant texts and saying Protestant prayers, and Irish and German Catholics felt like this was very exclusionary for them and went against their religious beliefs. So they pushed for including multicultural education in schools, including Catholicism. Once Irish and German immigrants kind of became subsumed into the general white category of people, you saw, less and less of that, and more separating from the push for German history and Irish history, and they kind of, seceded to the Protestant schooling at the time, especially as World War II was happening, World War I and World War II. And also, they kind of created their own separate school system, which is the Catholic school system that still is alive and well today. But as this book kind of goes through, what people wanted was their own heroes added into the narrative of the United States is this idyllic place to live, and it's moving towards equality, and they wanted heroes represented from their cultures added in, so that they can feel a part of the American Revolution. And that was supported by a wide variety of people, and a wide variety of cultures and races. However, in the civil rights movement, there was a push to have more Black history included in the curriculum, that included the honest truth of the way that the United States had been racially subordinating Black Americans, whether through slavery, Jim Crow, and basically everything, housing, loans, what have you. And so there was a push to have more Black history in schools. And of course, Black people are not a monolith, so there was a debate on how best to do this. There was a group of people who wanted to include it into the main U.S. history curriculum, so that everyone had to learn Black history as well as white history. And there was a group that wanted a class or curriculum specifically about Black history. And it became sort of an optional extracurricular course, which was primarily taken by Black students. So white students still weren't getting the history of their Black peers and the ramifications that the U.S. had on an entire group of people. So eventually, those courses, though they still exist in some schools, especially in urban areas, are not common in general high schools and public high schools in the United States. And instead, what you see is a multicultural education that handpicks specific individuals from different cultures to highlight as, representatives for each cultural group, so long as it fits the general narrative that the United States is a place of freedom and equality, and, moves in a positive direction, and that, it's one big gumbo. Ladson, Billings, and Tate, 1995, critique multicultural education as it was and still is implemented in the classrooms as focusing on a celebration of difference through foods and festivals approach, rather than a critical one, or what Sleater and Grant, 1987, describe as a social reconstructionist approach. That is, Payne and Welsh's claim that multicultural education has at its goal human equality aligns with the ways in which most schools, school districts, teachers, and textbook companies understand and interpret the purposes of not only multicultural education, but also public education in general, a celebration of America's melting pot, or the current liberal cliche, gumbo. The metaphor of the melting pot or gumbo fits well with the prevailing colorblind ideology that people must shun their ethnic and cultural differences in favor of an amalgamated and generic American identity. In the abstract, this idea of a unified American identity is seductive. However, history reminds us that for people of color in America, differences are rarely celebrated, much less equitably and incorporated into this fictitious and elusive American identity. So that begs the question, how should we teach these difficult issues? How, if we're going to talk about this, dark history of the United States, as well as current events, how do you do that? Right? The big fear with CRT is that you will have teachers standing on soapboxes and telling students what to think about the United States. And I just want to say now, teachers actually don't have the constitutional freedom of speech to do that. Teachers have incredibly limited speech rights. Like, the CRT laws do not affect this. Teachers' speech rights are incredibly limited, and they disclose their political opinions at their own risk, and administrations already do kind of maintain the rights to censor teacher speech. Additionally, political disclosure among educators is fairly unpopular. Most teachers prefer to have a neutral approach when providing information. Something that I think CRT has done the most damage, these CRT bans, where they've done the most damage is presenting facts as taking a stance. So teaching about, for example, like Japanese internment camps as a bad thing, that is not political soapboxing. That is not trying to convince a student to vote a particular way on an issue. That's simply informing students about something that happened, and students can draw their own conclusions about what to do with that information. But providing the facts is not. Additionally, CRT is a research framework, so they publish papers. What their findings are, again, are not opinions. They are research. They are facts. So when they find studies that show that generational wealth disparity between white people and black people is linked to inequitable housing opportunities from the civil rights era, that is not something that you could debate. That is something that we know to be true, and it's just inaccurate to present that as an opinion. It isn't an opinion. That is a true factual statement. An opinion would be, as a result, you should vote for X politician, or as a result, you should pay reparations, or as a result, we should do nothing and just pull people up by their bootstraps. As a result, we should XYZ. That would be a teacher getting on a soapbox and prescribing students how to think. That would be indoctrination, and that's not what we want. And it seems like that CRT critics are less concerned about indoctrination in some ways than they are about hiding the difficult past that the United States has, and perhaps indoctrinating students in their own line of thinking, which is everything is fine, and if we just ignore it, then it will be okay. Schools do not operate autonomously from the milieu of their local and regional politics. The Texas Board of Education, for example, has sought to rewrite the history of the United States by recasting U.S. chattel slavery as a work program and enslaved Americans as voluntary workers. Fernandez and Hauser, 2015. While there was pushback by university scholars and parents, it is significant that the official curriculum in the state of Texas is not only revisionist, but wholly inaccurate. Left uncorrected, this curriculum will have far-reaching impact on generations of students who will believe American slavery was a benign work program for immigrants. Moreover, this distortion of American history serves a more insidious purpose of rendering all demands for equity by African Americans as unwarranted claims for special treatment and unearned favors. While this is a prevailing view by a particular demographic, this distortion of history in the official public education curriculum is now institutionalized. End quote. So as you can see, there are huge, glaring issues with the way that multicultural education exists already, let alone with CRT bans that further seek to whitewash American history and paint America as a white knight with no flaws. So if we bring up these discussions in schools and if we talk about these issues, how do we do it? And this is where we get into the idea for controversial issue discussions in schools. So before I switch gears into that, my own take, I want to recommend a few books that you could read if you're interested in this topic that I will be citing throughout this. So the first one is The Political Classroom. Focus. By Dan Hess and Paula McAvoy. If you want to include civil discourse in your classroom, Hess is where to go. And she has another book called Controversy in the Classroom, The Democratic Power of Discussion, which is equally amazing. Definitely check it out. A newer book on this topic is by Zimmerman, The Case for Contention, co-written by Emily Robertson, and the subtitle is Teaching Controversial Issues in American Schools. So there's no better time to read these books than now, when U.S. history curriculum is under siege. So now that my book recommendations are out of the way, let's hop into it. If you see me reading, it's because I have scripted quite a bit of this next part of the video, just because I want it to be accurate and thought through. And I will try to avoid going on too many rants so this video isn't like 70 minutes long. So let's dive into why I believe that student discussion on politics and history should be encouraged in schools. Free speech is central to any reasonable vision of democracy because, quote, the ability to and willingness to engage in public discourse about matters of public policy and to question authority are perhaps the most distinctive aspects of citizenship in a liberal democracy, since they are precisely what distinguish citizens within a democracy from the subjects of an authoritarian regime. Kimlicka, 2001. Understood this way, any vision of civic education which does not promote the discussion of ideas and the freedom of speech will fail to impart students with the virtue central to democracy and the skills necessary to sustain it. In a democracy, each citizen is asked to vote. In the United States, most often people are asked to vote on who should represent them at varying levels of government, but occasionally they're asked to vote on amending their state constitution or the passage of a state law. In all these cases, the country is asking each person to have an opinion. Quote, controversies about the nature of the public good and how to achieve it, along with how to mediate among competing democratic values, are intrinsic parts of democracy, end quote. Hess, 2009. But for a democracy to thrive, it cannot be just any opinion. The success of a democracy depends on its people and their opinions, which means the opinions the people have and vote on should be informed. He who knows only his own side knows little of that. His reasons may have been good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons of the opposite side, if he does not know so much as what they are, he has no grounds for preferring either opinion. End quote. What this is getting at is students should be able to see all sides of an opinion in the classroom, so long as the facts are facts. Students should be able to discuss difficult questions like how to address racial inequity, how to address climate change, how to look at the history of the United States and reconcile it with the goals of the United States, and how to move the United States towards its goals of equality and freedom. These are questions that students should be able to grapple with. How do we improve as a society, whether it's in regards to race, gender, or sexual orientation? And CRT bans effectively end the opportunity for students to discuss those issues in schools. Another advantage to teaching these skills to students is their age. The voting age for national elections is 18, although in some local elections the voting age is as low as 16. Hart and Youniss, 2018. While some may argue that their age is a disadvantage because they biologically lack the maturity necessary to handle sensitive political topics, Hart and Youniss, 2018, found through a review of studies that 16-year-olds do not vary significantly in terms of relative capacities from young adults. Additionally, quote, if students did not talk about these issues in school, it was unlikely they would build the political literacy needed to weigh in on them when called upon to make decisions as participants in the political sphere, end quote, Hess and McAvoy, 2015. These are not young, innocent kids who don't have an impact on the political system. In fact, we start recruiting for the Army in high school. As a freshman, I remember ROTC and JROTC recruits coming into our cafeteria and asking us if we wanted to join the military. Students need to be able to make an informed decision on those topics, like whether or not they believe in military intervention, whether they have isolationist views or not, or if they take a humanitarian approach. Those are all things that we should be encouraging students to think about before making such a big commitment to the military or in an election. And classes that incorporate civic discussion have been found to have an array of positive outcomes for the student and by extension society compared to traditional lecture-style classes. Quote, studies that ask young people whether they had opportunities to discuss current issues in a classroom setting have consistently found that those who did participate in such discussions have a greater interest in politics, improved critical thinking and communication skills, more civic knowledge, and more interest in discussing public affairs outside of school. Compared to other students, they are also more likely to say they will vote and volunteer as adults. End quote. Battistoni, 2003, Hess, 2009. Additionally, Hess and McAvoy, 2015, find that students in classes with rich and frequent discussions find the classes more engaging and were learning more than they would have in a lecture class. Students also demonstrated more political knowledge and held it with more confidence. Perhaps most critically, students reported being more interested in listening to opinions contrary to their own. Free speech through civil discourse also promotes the health of democracy by promoting political tolerance and political equality. Hess, 2009, defines political tolerance as the willingness to extend important and significant rights to people who are different from oneself. In a country as diverse as the United States, political tolerance is extremely important in the health of its democracy. If a group of people begins to oppress another group of people because they are ideologically different from them, democracy fails. Quote, a society without political tolerance is likely to enact policies that deprive some people of their right to influence the political agenda and to have an influence on what is decided. That is, there will be no political equality. And absent political equality, there really is not a democracy. End quote. Hess, 2009. In the case of CRT bans, you have a group of people, conservatives, trying to limit what information students have at their disposal. You have a group of people trying to indoctrinate through the misinformation and hidden information to students. What I'm arguing for isn't we should exclude conservative voices from controversial issue discussion, or we should exclude conservative viewpoints on war, or even something like or social justice issues. What I'm saying is that by eliminating the discussion at all and then only providing the information from one side, we are indoctrinating students into a specific belief, and that is dangerous for democracy and for political discussion and for the growth of the United States. There is no such thing as a colorblind curriculum when clearly we have, in the United States, treated people differently based on the color of their skin for the majority of U.S. history, and to an extent even today. I'm sure I have more to say on this topic, but I'd really like to hear from you all what you would like me to dive more into on this. I have a lot of thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts about teacher political disclosure, but I just kind of wanted to focus this video on what I see as the benefits of discussing difficult topics like race in schools, and what I consider to be the best practice for doing so, which is civic discourse between students, facilitated by a neutral teacher. So let me hear your thoughts. What do you think? Leave your comments down below. If you want to see more of our content, click subscribe, ding the bell button to know when we post, and most importantly, I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!